As a quick reminder, when ethnic studies was first fought for, it focused on Blacks, Asian Americans, Native Americans, and Chicano student populations at San Francisco State University in the late 60s. As ethnic studies develops as a field, as a discipline, we began to expand for a more inclusive focus on additional marginalized statuses and groups of people, because at its core, ethnic studies is not simply about rehashing or re-narrativizing histories of marginalized and oppressed people. A lot of people think that when you take an ethnic studies class, you're just going to get some history lessons, and that's not what it's about. It's about analyzing the conditions of possibility, what people can and cannot do, what people have access to and what they don't have access to, the institutional and structural systems that shape how we live, how certain classifications, how certain identities that are mapped on your body shape how you get to exist in this world. And so we're thinking about understanding the complexity of identity in the making of each individual person, in communities of people, in nations of people, in the global context of people. So the work is enormous and expansive. As you move through ethnic studies courses, if you choose to move through ethnic studies courses, you're going to find a deeper engagement with more than just the core 4 members that were centered at the beginning. By introducing Arab American histories, for example, or feminisms, or LGBTQ and BIPOC identity concerns, we're introducing you to a more expansive form of inclusivity. We're taking you out of that very narrow focus of oppression and discrimination that only exists around a rhetoric of race, and think about a multitude of ways in which our society is structured around hierarchies that impact and affect people's daily lives. So I'm actually going to do 2 of the readings in this video. The first one is by Ariane Resnick. She is a special diet chef and certified nutritionist who creates indulgent, seemingly normal food out of simple, accessible, whole food ingredients. She writes about nutrition, health, wellness, identity, and creates recipes for brands. She is known as an iconoclast, which just means a nonconformist, of the wellness world, and a pioneering voice of accessibility and inclusivity within it. So she writes a very brief description that defines the acronyms that we often see regarding the queer community or the gay community. And she throws out a couple of other ideas that I wanted us to cover. Quickly, you all, I'm sure, know what LGBTQ+ means. BIPOC is Black, Indigenous, and people of color. The Black and Indigenous are often separated from people of color because oftentimes when we talk about people of color, we are conflating and collapsing experiences. And there's something unique about Black experiences and something unique about Indigenous experience that isn't captured by, say, immigration or the kinds of similarities or commonalities that Asian folks and Asian folks and Chicano folks and Arab folks and other people of color are often experiencing. Microaggressions. In the larger class, I talk about microaggressions in a great deal of detail, and I have us go through microaggressions. I want you to think about microaggressions. What's a microaggression like? Oh, you'd be so, you're so pretty for a big girl, or you're so pretty for a Black girl, or, oh, you're very articulate. It's those subtle kinds of comments that are made to people that make suggestions about who they are and what's to be expected of them, what they should be capable of, what they aren't capable of, certain beauty standards, that kind of thing are normalized in microaggressions. She goes over several things. What's the biggest challenges challenge of being both LGBTQ plus and a person of color. List the additional challenges faced by youth who are LGBTQ and BIPOC. How does racism manifest? These are pretty straightforward. All of these questions are pretty straightforward and are answered in this very brief piece, so I won't go into them in great detail in order to keep this video shorter. Our next piece, Different Fight, Same Goal, How the Black Freedom Movement Inspired Early Gay Activism, was written by Joe Yurkaba, a reporter for NBC Out, the LGBTQ+ section of the NBC News Digital. They go by the pronouns they, them. They cover a variety of topics, including politics, abortion policy, and science and health. They also did a short stint as a food and music journalist. Joe's work has been published by NBCnews.com, Elle, Teen Vogue, Marie Claire, Very Well, Women's Day, Bustle, and Rewire.news, among other publications. The point of Different Fight, Same Goal is to think about the ways in which the Black Freedom Movement, and remember, the Black Freedom Movement is the movement that comes after the Civil Rights Movement that begins in the mid to late 60s. And it is a shift in a focus on getting legal change to a focus on seeing those legal changes actually practice in reality. Remember, we talked about de facto and de jure during the first week, that the civil rights movement allowed for a lot of legal changes. There's a lot of rights gained in the law during the civil rights movement that weren't necessarily being practiced. And so when we have the student protest, the student strike at San Francisco in the late 60s, we are in the midst of the Black Freedom Movement. The Civil Rights Movement and the Black Freedom Movement were pivotal movements for the movements of the activism for other groups of color, the activism for other people, including the queer community, right? So Joe goes over or mentions several different terms and concepts, and I want to just go over a couple of them with you so that you are clear from the reading. The homophile movement, in an effort to address the discrimination that they face by authorities, people of the queer community, gays, lesbians, trans people, started organizing formally in the 1950s. So while the 1960s was a pivotal shift in gay rights organizing, it actually begins earlier than that. It was called homophile organizations in order to emphasize their sense of community and de-emphasize the sexual aspect of their identity that so concerned the public. These pioneering groups worked to provide awareness, education, and unification of these oppressed minorities. It was predominantly male-driven. When we think about the queer community, oftentimes it comes down to is very narrow focused on sex. And it's not the same when you're talking about straight communities. Straight communities, the heterosexual community, there's not a focus on sex in the same way. So in their naming process, they wanted to shift away from that focus and that centering on actual sex acts and start to think about the whole embodiment of people, which is what we should be doing, right? If you're going to be thinking about someone's rights, you're thinking about them as a human being in the world. You know what I mean? So the homophile movement was established in the 1950s. The name changes over time, as names often do. The Janus Society is an early gay rights group. the 1963 march in Bayard Rustin, I'm going to talk about together. So Bayard Rustin he was a strategist, a pacifist. He was a very prominent civil rights activist that has been largely erased because he also was an openly gay man, which was at odds with the Victorian respectability politics of the period of the 1950s, 60s, and 70s. However, he was a very close advisor to Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. He was very prominent in the civil rights movement. He was very, very engaged, not just for Black people's rights, but for gay rights. He was the organizer for the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. It is the march where the 1963 I Have a Dream speech was made by Martin Luther King Jr. So it's the one that you all know a lot about. It was actually organized by Rustin. So one of the arguments that's being made, and I want to talk a little bit about Tammany's use of the civil rights tactic being described as plagiarism. So it's clear that many movements of other people's organizing has been heavily influenced by the organizing efforts of the civil rights movement. Sit-ins, fish-ins for Native American people, different peaceful protests, or make direct lines to the Black civil rights activists. Those peaceful, direct forms of activism. Now, Tammany was a co-founder of the Mattachine Society in Washington, D.C. He was one of the first homophile group participants and members, and he drew his strategies directly from Black civil rights movements. He's often accused of plagiarizing because while he was using those strategies, he didn't necessarily center or include Black people in his organizing efforts, nor did he give credit to Black people for his organizing efforts and tactics. So that's where that plagiarism comes about. Oftentimes, the queer community is racially ambiguous or racially white. Oftentimes the queer community doesn't include other people. It's like there's a queer community activism and then there's Black activism or Asian activism. But there are in fact queer people who are Black people who are queer, Asian people who are queer, you know, and those concerns, those intersections of identity are really important for how they understand themselves in the world, how they're moving through the world with these different labels affixed or adhered to their bodies. And so when we're talking about plagiarism, it's that there's a level of erasure that's also happening when white gay activists are not interested in an investment in the racialized aspects that are also really important to how people are being able to access rights. You know what I mean? It's the same thing with the feminist movement. The feminist movement has a womanist leg because the feminist movement with a capital F centers on white middle-class women's identities, right? And it's not taking into account the other different social impacts that are informing women who are trans, or women who are of color, or women who are of, you know, lower socioeconomic standing, so a class basis. There is a way in which the feminist movement and the gay rights movement centers like middle-class whiteness in a way that erases those additional identity formations. So Joe writes, influence can be the influence of ideas, and specifically ideologies. It could be the influence of strategies. Influence can also be in the form of people who move between the movements, right? Who are engaged in multiple movements. So who are engaged in the Black freedom movement, who are engaged in the LGBTQ movement, who are engaged in a class-based or Marxist movement to think about class and economic standing, who are engaged in multiple concerns that impact people's livelihood. The 1979 National March on Washington for Gay and Lesbian Rights had some 200,000 protesters, was held on October 14th, 1979 in Washington, D.C. Now, again, similar to the March on Washington in 1963, which was a civil rights tactic for bringing awareness to jobs and freedom, the economic issues concerning Black communities, the queer community does a similar March on Washington for gay rights. So it's the use of similar tactics. Not that there's anything wrong with using similar tactics. The issue is that there's the erasure of Black concerns or the erasure of concerns of people of color in those movements as well. Black civil rights movement strategies also affected how early LGBTQ activists conducted peaceful demonstrations. It's a coalition of gay and lesbian organizations held a yearly peaceful protest in Independence Hall called the Annual Reminder from 1965 to 1969, which were influenced by early civil rights demonstration in which demonstrators were instructed to dress respectably. So thinking about respectability politics, with women in dresses and men in suits. This is a very prominent civil rights tactic. If you look at any of the photos of the civil rights marches, you will see people in their Sunday best, women in stockings and heels, and oftentimes gloves and hats, men in suits. It was a tactic. It was a part of presenting a very respectable, nonviolent, peaceful identity that was oftentimes met with violence by the state. And so it allowed for a number of things. The prominent thing was on a national level, the rhetoric about the United States being a democracy was often contradicted by the actions that they saw during those protests, with the state violating the rights of Black people who were dressed the part, who were doing their part, who were just protesting down the street, right? Both movements were united against police violence, state repression, and capitalist exploitation. One of the earliest instances of military resistance to police-based oppression was in 1966, Compton's cafeteria riots. The legal strategy challenging racial segregation, which was pioneered by the NAACP in the 1940s, was really the wellspring from which the LGBTQ equality movement grew. Okay, so I'm going to end this on that note. All of these are pretty straightforward, but I did want to clarify a couple of those things for you and make those connections.